All right, okay, last talk of the conference. This has been amazing. Check out the, like pyrotechnics and stuff, all of these things coming off the stage. A Hulk, oh my God. How about we give it up for all of the conference organizers who put all of this together for us. That was really amazing.
I can help you with that, man. Actually, unplug it right here.
All right, are you ready to have some fun? We're gonna learn how to make complex and beautiful animations in Vue.js. My name is Sarah Drasner. I go by Sarah Edo on Twitter. This is me picking my nose as a child and also my relationship with authority, my poor mother. I used to be a consultant, which did not mean that I was unemployed. I worked with all of these companies here. But recently, I took a job with Microsoft as a senior cloud developer advocate, which I'm really excited about. Okay, so before we dig into all the ways that you can animate on the web, it's kind of important that we discuss why you'd even want to animate on the web. So let's start off with a quote. We've evolved to perform actions more or less seamlessly. We aren't wired to deal with the fits and starts of human-computer interaction. So what she means by that, what Tammy Everett means by this is we don't have Boolean states when we're looking at something. I didn't just pop up onto the stage, right? I transitioned onto the stage by walking on. And in fact, our occipital lobe only works in 100 millisecond bursts. So what that means for you is that anything that pops out into your face is usually something that's dangerous or scary or not supposed to be there, or something that maybe you should be alerted to. So timing on the web is incredibly important. Timing is pivotal for jokes. This is a really bad dark UX pattern you're probably familiar with. When you visit a site for the first time, you haven't even looked around yet, and all of a sudden it's asking you for your information. I'm always like, come on, buy me a drink first. If you think I'm being picky, know that Google agrees, and it actually will impact your SEO if you have a timed interstitial on mobile. So here's an example of how we can gain spatial understanding on the web. This is an example from Code Drops where just choosing your seats allows you to be able to get a real sense of how that experience would feel and what's ahead of you, what's in store for you during that experience. You're also seamlessly transitioned from one place to another. So without transitions, we lose an opportunity. The user has to remap every interactive space, which creates kind of a cognitive load for us, and it doesn't feel as fluid. It feels more clunky. In Paul Bacchus's Illusion of Speed, he addresses some of these studies and shows that lots of small, tiny little activities in a short amount of time are perceived as really long, whereas one continuous activity is actually perceived as very short. So I made this pen to show you what that might look like. In this instance, we have a map marker that in turn becomes a contact form. Labels move out of the way to gather input, and they become loaders. And those, in turn, become the success. And now, if I said to you, where is that contact form? You'd say, oh, it's in there. But there's no in there. It's just a bunch of divs and absolute positioning and form elements. But because instead of popping modal after modal in front of your face, it really actually feels like one seamless activity. So people often ask me how to animate in Vue, and there's actually a ton of different ways, so we're going to go through a whole bunch of them. They'll start off simple, and we're going to get progressively more complex as the talk goes on. So first, because Vue is a relatively young framework, we're going to talk a little bit about directives, and what Vue has to offer before we dig in. We'll talk about the transition component, in case you're not familiar with it. Then we'll talk about the watchers and the reactivity system, which is kind of makes sense since we're at ReactiveConf. We'll talk about custom directives, we'll talk about page transitions, and then we'll talk about some data visualization. Okay, so we don't really have time to dive into everything that Vue has to offer, so I'm just going to show one of the many directives that's really, really compelling. These kind of directives and all of these abstractions keep you from yak shaving. I realize not everybody knows what yak shaving is. Yak shaving is anytime you have to go do some other activity in order to get started with the current activity. So anytime you're wasting time kind of doing something else. So we eliminate a lot of this kind of work that we're doing over and over and over again with Vue because it has some really beautiful abstractions. So in order to keep you productive, Vue offers simple ways to hook into some deeper functionality. And this is stolen from Angular, but simplified in Vue. One of the more interesting directives, it's vModel. So first, we're setting up our Vue instance, and you can see in our data, we have this thing called message, and then there's a message in there. If you're from a React background, this is similar to getting initial state. So the text area is just a normal semantic text area, except it has one difference. It has that vModel directive that's connecting it to that message that you just saw. And it outputs in those mustache templates here. So when the user types things, we're automatically both allowing it to update and also continuing to store it for ourselves. We're not having to check the DOM. We're not having to set state. It all updates automatically with the reactivity system. And in terms of animation, because that relationship was established with so much ease, it's also incredibly simple to do advanced effects given any kind of information given. So you already know how half of that demo works. We're going to talk about how the other half works too. And this, along with the other abstractions offered, speeds up your development in a really slick way. So let's dig into the transition component for a moment. Let's say you have a modal component that only shows based on a condition. It would show like this, which is easily done, but we talked a little bit before about how that's not great. It's popping in our face. It's just a Boolean state, so maybe let's transition that. So if you haven't worked with it before, here's what the transition component looks like. We wrap that in a condition. We wrap that conditional, and it's super simple and easy to read and maintain. And here you have two ways of describing what's changing that we can hook into. It's the enter and leave states. So you can see vEnter and vEnter2. vEnter is like right before the transition for the entrance occurs. Enter2 are the styles for what happens after. And that vEnter active is what we're going to plug into for any interpolation. So our transition will plug into that vEnter active, and we can say something like this. If we just want a simple interpolation, this is like the most basic thing you can do. You just say transition, opacity, 1 second ease. And here's the base of what we need. It states the intermediary values and what should happen once it's done and when it's leaving. And we don't have to declare the initial stages because the browser will fall back to the defaults, whatever's on the element itself. So here we have something that's a little bit better, a transition from one state to another rather than that Boolean, which is great. But what if we want to make the background fade out of view while the thing in the foreground is, kind of capturing our attention? That's kind of a useful thing to have happen. We could wrap it in a transition component, but man, that's like wrapping the entire page in a transition component. Is there something simpler? Well, yeah, there definitely is. This is a pretty legible way of adjusting and changing those classes based on a state transition. We could also bind inline styles. We don't have to use classes even necessarily. So we use a simple ternary state to see what happens before and after that transition occurs. And now we have classes that we can hook into, create some transitions. We have the transition class as well as the blur and opacity. So here we have something better with minimal effort. It shows and hides the modals and blurs the background, and now it's a component that we can reuse. So aside from keeping the changes consistent and granular, there's some nice pieces of sugar offered here, like transition modes. And what this will allow us to do is say, if two things are changing at once, one thing's entering while another thing's leaving, what happens? Does it wait for the other thing to fire and then kind of bring in the next one? Luckily, because of these transition modes, it makes it really simple to write that without any callbacks or any kind of delays. So we looked at this example a bit earlier, that moment that there's like that awkward moment where both of them are in the DOM at once, and that doesn't feel very good. That feels kind of clunky. So you can have these awkward visual pauses and visual inconsistencies. So this looks like it's one element, but it's actually two elements. One of them is transitioning out, and the other one's transitioning in. And with those transition modes, it's happening really, really seamlessly. We're not writing a callback. We're not making really weird imperative code with scheduled delays that we then have to change if we have to change the timing. So just to be sure you can see what I'm referring to here, I'm showing an example without transition modes. You can see the picture snaps forward, and we missed the other animation. It happened behind it. So of the two modes, the one I always reach for is out in. That's probably the one that you want 9 times out of 10. That's the one finishes transitioning out and then comes in. And when we start talking about page transitions later, this is really important. So we have the transition component, that transition mode, and we're using a slot here to replace the content, which allows us to change the component easily and with really nice defaults. Okay, so we talked about a transition. How about a CSS animation? We're still going to use that transition component, but now we can assign classes based on the enter and leave states. And we can also plug into CSS animation libraries if we want. So, we can do something like bounce this ball and roll it out every time we have something occurring. And in the demo, you can see that if I wrap that in a v-if statement with that transition component, giving the entrance and exit a class name. Bounces in CSS are a bit of a drag. They're a little bit easier to write in JavaScript, but we can make our code a little drier here using a mixin. Okay, so now we get to the really good stuff. JavaScript is really powerful for animation, so let's do some cool stuff with Vue and JavaScript animation hooks. So here we have some custom naming for our hooks. Each part is available to us. We can use as many of these as we'd like. We don't have to use any of them. We can also state that the CSS is false so that that transition component is not going to go looking in the CSS for things. It's going to go looking in our methods instead. So here's like the most basic example of that. I usually don't use all of them. I usually use like an enter and a leave. And then in my methods, I'm using these hooks, and I'm also going to state when the animation is done. So in this demo, we can hook up the V model and animate our text into the book in a really playful manner. We've got the transition component with before enter, enter, and a CSS class binding. And in the data, we have a default component in before enter, and you can see that the styles that we need to accomplish this animation, we're putting in that before enter hook. And the reason people ask me why I don't set that in CSS or in styles directly on the component instead, and part of the reason for that is these styles are really important for the way that that animation works, and they change the way that that animation works. But if it's not animating, you can't see them. They don't do anything. So if you're maintaining a large code base with a lot of other developers, they might come along, we like to delete code. Everybody likes to delete code. They'll be like, oh, if I take this out, nothing has changed. I'll just remove it. But by putting these kind of together in the same place, you're making an association. It's a little bit more easy to maintain. People can say, oh, this probably is related to the animation. So here in the data, in the enter, we have all of our animation logic, and we're able to scatter things around and apply them to a timeline and do bounces and eases and all sorts of really fun JavaScript animation logic. So it's just like such a super party. That's my face when I'm animating in Vue with JavaScript. Okay, so we know about the transition component. What about the transition group component? Let's take a look at that for just a second, because that's a really fun one. You may or may not be familiar with flip in animation, but what flip stands for is first, last, invert, play. It's one way to make sure that you have really silky, smooth animations on the web. When you animate margin, left, things like that, you cause repaints. So transforms are actually the way to get the most smooth animations on the web. But in order to animate something from one place to another, what we'd have to do is we'd have to get the bounding client rec of each one of them, and then we'd have to figure out all the transforms that happen in between those two states. So that works really well, but the trouble is it's really difficult to implement. You have to go get both coordinates, you have to invert them, you have to find the differences in between them and apply the changes. And for one element, it's okay, but what if you have 100 elements, or you have a bunch of data coming from an API, or something like that? And that's actually when you really need it. That's when you need the best performance, is when you're animating a ton of DOM elements. So it becomes a little clunky to write. Well, with Vue's transition group, all you have to do is wrap those elements, and Vue takes care of the rest of you under the hood, the rest for you under the hood. So here you can see we're making use of the v-for loop we talked about earlier, and now we can make a game of lazy Sudoku. This is from the guide, where you can just keep hitting that, and it will keep playing for you until you finally win. So how do we use this in a real application? With a combination of Vue's computed properties, which cache the logic, we can filter a lot of data and show the results in a really performant manner with just a few lines of code that would typically take hours for us to write. And Snipcart's post does a really good job of explaining all of this too. Okay, so we talked about the transition component, but we're at ReactiveConf, so I think it's fitting that we can talk about how animation fits in with Vue's reactivity system. Vue has really, really nice abstractions, but typically what ends up happening is abstractions start to fail when we find these use cases that aren't exactly our use case. Well, luckily, Vue allows us to dig deeper, and it allows us deeper access so that we can write, we're never like beholden to these abstractions, we can actually access the reactivity system if we want. So that we can leverage this for asynchronous updates and transitions and animations. And so the way that we'll plug into the system is called watchers. In order for you to understand how we're working with them, let's talk a little bit about reactivity first. So what is reactive? I think usually when I ask developers this question, they say, RxJS, which is true. RxJS is reactive programming, but reactive programming is a really big umbrella, and RxJS fits under that umbrella. There's actually a lot of ways to write reactive programming. So let's kind of define it first, and then we'll go through how it's implemented. So reactive programming is programming with asynchronous data streams. Okay, what? All right, so here's another example or another definition. A stream is a sequence of ongoing events ordered in time that offer some hooks with which to observe it. That is a little bit more clear. I think the example that almost everybody uses is an Excel sheet. If you have one cell and another cell, and then you want to make the sum of those appear in another cell, what you're allowed to do is you can change the value of the first one, and it automatically updates in that sum. And that's reactive programming. Reactive programming, I think Mike Bostock, who wrote D3, said it best. Reactive programming is really compelling because it allows you to write asynchronous code as if you were writing it synchronously. So when we use reactive premises for building applications, this means it's really easy to update state in reaction to user events, which is kind of a typical use case, right? Where a lot of us are reacting to events when we make application logic. And Andre Saltz has a really great post on this on GitHub, too. So what is reactive? For all of these different frameworks, we have different ways of working with it. Angular 1.x has dirty checking. Cycle and Angular 2 use reactive streams like Xstream and RxJS. Vuex, MobX, and Reactive all use a variation of getters and setters. And despite the name, I know this is confusing, despite the name, React is not reactive. It uses a pull approach rather than push. I was talking to Dan Abramoff about this, and he was like, yeah, everybody's confused about this. I'm sorry about the name. So he pointed me to this place where you can look at the React design documentation if you want to know more information about that. There's also posts about Vue's reactivity documentation, and Damien Dulles has a really great post from Montreal as well. So, okay, we're going to watch any data property declared on the Vue instance. What I mean by that is we have in our data that counter. That counter starts at 0. And when I use watch to look at that counter, that console log is going to, we're basically going to allow for a console log every time something changes, every time we have an update. So if the state is similar enough, you can simply transition the state with watchers. Here I've built from scratch a chart with Vue, and as the data changes, the watchers will update and it will simply transition between them. And SVG is good for this because it's built with math, so it's really, really good tool for this job. So if you pair SVGs with directives in Vue, you don't even need a charting library. I didn't use D3 or Chartist or anything here. I just used a few directives from Vue, and I'm able to eliminate that entire library. This is for the x-axis, which is actually way more complicated than the bars. The bars are like a v-for loop and done. So that's really cool. So first, when we're using those watchers, we'll create a dummy object that will be updated by our animation library. Then we'll have an update function that's invoked on every tween step. We use this to push the data. Then we create an object to hold the source data and the function pointer for update events. And in this for loop, we turn the current index into a string. And then we can tween over our target dummy object, and we'll only do this for the specific key. So we can also use animation in watchers to create something like this time difference dial. I travel a lot, and my coworkers do too, and we're all in different areas. So I made this to kind of keep track of what the local time was in different areas, so I'm not scheduling meetings for them at 4 in the morning or something. So we also have that visual signification of whether it's daytime or nighttime to kind of pair with that as well. And my syntax highlighting fell off of this slide. But we're watching the checked property, and we'll fire different animations that change the hue and saturation based on some relative association to where it existed before, to the current time. And as a quick side note, using a native method called toLocaleTimeString, I was able to remove a giant library like moment.js, and this will actually even respect daylight savings data. So that's a really cool native method. You should check it out. So with Vue, we can also respond to synthetic events midstream, like I did with this ball bouncing in SVG. I can update the radius and change the height while it's bouncing around. And we don't even have to plug into watchers to leverage them to interpolate state either. Vue offers class and style bindings, so it lets us connect user interaction and element styles. You might have seen similar demos to this. Like I made this with like SVG and some weird Tron-like graphics. But you might have seen similar demos to this with CSS variables and JavaScript. But in this case, Vue allows for more backwards compatibility, so this will work on IE and Edge as well. So in the instance here, we start with x at 0 and y at 0. We're going to track progress with eClient x and y, and we can hook it up to our styles, in this case, just perspective origin, and then we have you know, a template literal where I'm plugging in those x and y values pretty easily. So SVG animation and Vue end up becoming really good friends because they play so nicely together for those updates. So let's look at this little Wally I made from a dribble shot. Wally has a looping animation in the way he looks around and blinks. Then as my mouse or this little cockroach guy who's his friend moves, he follows his little buddy around. It's also worth mentioning that anytime you have a user respond to something with emotion, they're more likely to remember it later because it'll attach to their limbic system. So anytime you make something that's a little bit more charming or makes them sad or something, they'll be able to recall that information better. So in the Vue template, we create a mouse move event in the HTML, and then in the methods in JavaScript. There's a bit of logic I'm not showing here, but basically, you can think of it like this. There's one kind of blinking head turning movement that's happening all the time, and then there's another animation where he's extending his arms that I like create first. I pause that timeline, and then I allow Vue to scrub the timeline. That's that eClient X and like the paused progress here. So far, all of our animations have been in lockstep with each other and just another small piece of our application. But what happens if it's a giant application and there's a bit of state that you want communicated across a bunch of different components? Well, you might be familiar with Redux from React. Vue has a similar thing called Vuex. It's basically like the Redux of Vue. To be clear, you can still use Redux in Vue. That's totally fine. But it is kind of nice to use the one that is for the framework. So once we've encapsulated what's changing, each component owns its own state, and the entrance will always be consistent, as well as the exit. So we can reuse these components, change their order, and manage their state in a really clean and simple manner. So in this example, I'm not even passing state around. I create a central store with Vuex, and in mutations, I number these templates, toggle their visibility, and advance the templates, looping back around when I get to the final one. And this is all inside of one SVG. We have different components based on the state of our store, each with their own entrance. And I'm committing to the store and toggling, and like when that toggle fires, and we have our animation logic actually like hooked into a lifecycle method. So again, like if you're familiar with React, you'd use component did mount. Here we use mounted in Vue, and we have all of our animation logic as soon as that component is mounted. So if you're not familiar with lifecycle methods, this is like as a child is coming in, we have a few events that we can hook into. So, okay, custom directives. We talked about directives like that V model before, but let's say you're doing something very specific and repetitive, and you need deeper access to your application, and you don't want to just create an event. You want to actually use a directive. Well, Vue allows us to make our own custom directives, so let's apply that to animation. So here's how you would create a Vue custom directive. It's probably the most common to hook into bind. So we've got a custom directive called vtac, but it's actually not that useful yet. It's just like making the thing position fixed. So let's do one better. We'll pass the value into the directive. It's a bit more flexible. Then we can call vtac on the directive and stick the element at 70 pixels down from the top. So you can see it as I scroll down the page, it's stuck at 70 pixels. So let's do one better from that. We'll pass in more than one value. And here we can make it really flexible, and we can tack the element anywhere. So okay, let's apply this to animation. In this example, we'll create a directive that attaches to the scroll event. It allows you to hook into that functionality and do animation or something, and then you can remove the listener. So now we're really cooking with gas. We can emit an entire library like waypoints and just use, or like scroll magic or something like that, and just use custom directives to orchestrate these interesting interactives on our pages. So I'm in the process of making this demo, but this is a sneak peek. We can use these custom directives to hook into D3's functionality and do some scrolly telling as we move down the page. So here you see our custom directive in action. We can use this to update those circles based on some fireball data that I got from NASA, and we're updating all of the visualizations on that page. So I'm saying total impact, and then I'm also returning. I have some logic here that connects to D3, and then I'm returning when we want to remove that event listener. Okay, now we're going to talk about page transitions. You've got 2 things to go. I know that you've been like very, very patient and you like super engaged all day today, but we're almost done. Nuxt is a really, really great tool for building out Vue applications. It's similar to next.js for React. So we have things like routing and page transitioning and server-side rendering and code splitting just out of the box. So you might have heard people talk about server-side rendering of late. If you're not familiar with the idea or the concept or why you would do this, I think this is probably the best quote I've heard about it. By rendering on the server, you can cache the final shape of your data. And what that really allows you to do is not do a lot of the template logic in the client and do it on the server instead, which really speeds up your process. It allows for some better SEO. So that's really, really compelling. So if you don't already have Vue CLI installed, here's that command. We'll only have to run that once. Then once it's installed, any time we want to spin up a project, we'll just write Vue init Nuxt starter and the name of your project, and you have code splitting, routing, server-side rendering, all set up for you without ever stepping outside of a Vue file. So you'll be given an index page in the pages directory. If you dump that content and simply create a Vue file and a Nuxt link, you get a duplicate of that page, and you have links that point to one another. So a fully routed single-page application with server-side rendering. I think that's really cool. And Nuxt is also amazing because you don't have to wrap anything in a transition component either. It already offers you a hook for that. So all I have to do to create page transitions literally is write a bit of CSS that plugs into that. So we've got page enter active, page leave active, page enter, and page leave active. That's so cool to create those page transitions because it's really hard to coordinate page transitions a lot of the time. I feel like I'm always making a mess of page transitions, and all I have to do is write a little bit of code here. And we don't just have to use transitions either. We can create animations too. Don't ever make your page transition this way. I was just having fun. But of course, my favorite thing is the JavaScript hooks. So we have transition modes available to us, just the way that we saw earlier, so we can make sure one page is done, leaving before the other one comes in. And we can use these hooks to create all of our animation logic. And we can create something like this, where you can see each different page is actually animating differently. All of those mountains and text all has its own kind of animation.
I don't want to be a buzzkill, but we're like running a little bit over time.
Okay, I'll speed it up for the last two.
Good.
Okay, sorry. And there's the demo to explore the code. The last thing today we'll look at is Vue and serverless. I think serverless is a really cool thing with a really clickbaity title. Really, anybody who works with serverless functions is going to tell you that you're still using a server. But the promise of serverless is that you're no longer having to babysit a server or scale it or maintain it. So basically, you can write these functions, and that's why we call it functions as a service. So you're just writing the function, and basically, you don't have to babysit your server and scale it, and you can have the pricing reflect that as well. So as I mentioned before, I work for Microsoft as a developer advocate, and people often ask where my team is speaking. So with 3.js and Vue and some computed properties, I'm using a serverless function to gather all of that, the geolocation data for that, and then I'm able to update this globe. I'm going to run through this really quickly. We're receiving all of the geolocation data. We're caching all of those entries. And then we're able to run that function in the portal. And then we're going to use that for our 3.js globe. We have a single element, and then we're going to call on that mounted hook, that 3.js. We're going to pass in the texture. And not that you'd want to do this, but because Vue and 3.js play together so easily, you can easily update that globe from a circle to any other thing like an icosahedron. So we can create myriad data visualizations very simply, and we get Vue to do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. So Vue makes it extraordinarily simple to create complex and beautiful interactions that feel seamless for our users. We can connect states and reduce cognitive load for things that are changing in our application with ease. And I'd like to say, finally, as a personal note, that sometimes building and maintaining large applications on a corporate deadline can start to burn you out. This happened to me, and by working with animations, something that gives both you and your users a dopamine rush of excitement, I was able to stave off burnout and remember why I love working on the web so damn much. Thank you so much.